welcome to Talk Tensors.
Yeah, it's really great to be here.
So for those of you joining us, this is our professional machine learning academic paper summarization deep dive. We are geared towards the intellectually curious. And today we're doing something just a little bit different.
We are indeed. We're opening up the vault today.
Yeah, normally we're chasing our Active feed, right? Looking at whatever dropped like last Tuesday. Yeah. But today we are looking at a paper from early 2018.
Right.
And honestly, it represents this massive tectonic shift in how we handle data that just doesn't fit neatly into a box.
It's an absolute classic. I mean, if you look at the timeline of geometric deep learning, there is a very distinct before and after when it comes to this specific paper.
Exactly. So we are talking about graph attention networks, GACs. This was published at ICLR in 2018. And for you listening, our mission today is to tear this paper apart. We're going to go line by line, equation by equation, because we need to understand not just what they did, but why it actually worked when literally every other approach was just hitting a wall.
And we should probably mention the pedigree of this paper, too. It's heavy.
Absolutely.
You've got Peter Veličković, Guillaume Cucurol, Aranza Casanova, Adriano Romero, Petar Lio, and
Yoshua Bengio.
Right, Yoshua Bengio.
The Turing Award winner himself. I mean, when Bengio puts his name on a paper that has the word attention in the title, you generally pay attention.
You really do. They basically assembled the Avengers of graph learning to solve this one very specific bottleneck.
Right. So the core thesis of the paper, just to give you all a roadmap for this deep dive, is that GATs introduced masked self-attention to graph-structured data, which allowed neural networks to dynamically weigh the importance of different neighbors.
Without requiring those wildly costly matrix operations.
Exactly. And without even knowing the graph structure in advance, which is huge. But before we get into the linear algebra, I really want to set the scene. So take me back to late 2017 or early 2018.
Right.
What was the deep learning landscape actually looking like back then?
So it was basically the era of Euclidean dominance. If you were working in ML in 2017, you essentially had two main hammers in your toolbox.
Right.
You had convolutional neural networks, or CNNs. And those had completely conquered computer vision.
Completely.
And then you had recurrent neural networks, RNNs, LSTMs, and those were the absolute kings of sequence data, text, audio, that sort of thing.
Right. And I think the common thread there for both of those is structure. It's regularity.
Exactly. I mean, a CNN works precisely because an image is a grid. It's a Euclidean structure. You know for a fact that pixel 00 is always in the top left.
Yeah.
And it always has exactly three neighbors.
Right.
Down diagonal. So you can just slide a 3x3 filter across that grid because the grid itself never changes. The spatial relationship is a constant.
And text is similar, just in one dimension.
Right. Text is just a line, a 1D grid. Word A is always followed by word B. The distance is fixed.
But, and here's the massive problem that was starting to really annoy researchers in 2017, the world isn't always a grid.
No. Nature is incredibly messy. It's relational.
Yeah, I mean, think about social networks. You don't have 4 perfectly spaced neighbors like a pixel does.
Right.
You might have 500 friends, and I might only have 3.
Exactly. Or, think about biology. Proteins. They fold in 3D space. They interact with other proteins based on these complex electrostatic forces, not some rigid grid.
Or telecommunication networks.
Yeah.
Or citation networks. These are all irregular domains.
They're graphs. Non-Euclidean domains. And in 2017, we were really struggling to apply deep learning to them.
Because we had these incredibly powerful neural networks, but they would just choke as soon as the data wasn't a perfect matrix.
Yeah, we were trying to force a square peg into a round hole, or, a graph into a CNN. The math just did not translate. You can't define a left or right neighbor in a social network. There's no directionality like that.
So what were people actually doing before this paper dropped? Because we had spectral approaches, right?
We did. And this is where things get a bit mathematically heavy, so bear with me.
Yeah.
The first real attempt to do deep learning on graphs used spectral graph theory.
Right. Joan Bruna and folks like that were pioneering this.
Exactly.
And I always say spectral sounds like we're hunting ghosts, but we are really talking about the spectrum of a matrix here.
Specifically the Laplacian matrix. To define a convolution on a graph, they basically had to move the whole operation into the Fourier domain.
Okay.
So they used the eigendecomposition of the graph's Laplacian matrix to define these filters.
Okay, hold on. Let's break that down for the listener, because If someone hasn't touched linear algebra since undergrad, what does relying on the eigendecomposition of the Laplacian actually mean in plain English?
Sure. Think of a graph like the skin of a drum.
A drum skin, okay.
The Laplacian eigenvectors basically describe the natural vibration modes of that drum, the harmonics.
Right.
So spectral CNNs were learning filters based on those very specific harmonics.
Which sounds elegant mathematically.
It's beautiful math, really elegant. But it has a fatal flaw when you actually try to use it in practice.
It's way too brittle.
Extremely brittle.
Yeah.
Because those harmonics depend entirely on the exact shape of the drum. If you change the shape even slightly, let's say you just add one single new node to your social network, the harmonics change.
So the basis functions completely change.
Right. Which means the filters you spent all that compute learning on the old graph.
They're totally useless on the new graph.
Exactly. They're meaningless.
Yeah.
The coefficients you learned now correspond to frequencies that might have shifted, or they might not even exist anymore.
And that right there is the definition of transductive learning, isn't it?
Yes.
You can only make predictions on the specific graph you trained on.
It is like learning to navigate a city by strictly memorizing the GPS coordinates of every single pothole.
That's a great analogy.
Right. If I drop you in a different city, or even if they just pave the road in the same city, you are completely lost.
Right.
You haven't actually learned the rules of driving. You just memorize the geometry of that one specific road.
Right. So these spectral methods were way too heavy computationally, and they broke if the graph changed. So they were out for large dynamic data sets. But then we got GCNs, Graph Convolutional Networks, Kipton-Welling, 2017.
Yes, GCNs were a massive step forward. They basically looked at the spectral stuff and said, let's approximate this using Chebyshev polynomials so we don't have to calculate those terrible eigenvectors.
Right, much faster.
Way faster. And they restricted the filters to only look at immediate first-order neighbors.
Yeah.
It was cleaner, but it was a blunt instrument.
Break that down. Why blunt?
So a GCN aggregates information from neighbors based entirely on the graph structure itself, specifically the degree of the nodes.
Okay.
It effectively treats every single neighbor roughly the same, just normalized by how heavily connected they are.
So bringing it back to the social network, if I'm a node and I have my absolute best friend who I message every single day,
Yeah.
and then I also have a neighbor who is just some guy I met once at a conference 5 years ago.
To a GCN, they are both just neighbors. It mixes their features together with these fixed weights derived strictly from the graph topology. It cannot dynamically say, hey, listen to the best friend and ignore the conference guy.
It lacks attention.
Precisely. It fundamentally lacks the ability to weigh the input based on the actual content or features of the neighbor. It only cares about the structure.
Which brings us to the third big pre-2018 method, GraphSage, Hamilton et al.
Right. GraphSage. This was arguably the first method to really crack the inductive problem, the unseen graph problem, because it threw out the spectral math entirely. It just sampled neighbors.
Sampled being the operative word there.
Yeah. GraphSage basically says, I cannot possibly process all of your neighbors. That's too computationally expensive. So I'm just going to pick a fixed size neighborhood, say 20 neighbors at random, average their features, and call it a day.
I mean, it's efficient.
Highly efficient.
But is it optimal?
Probably not, because you are explicitly throwing away data. You might sample pure noise and entirely miss the signal.
Right. If I have 1,000 neighbors and the only one that actually dictates my behavior is the 900th one.
Random sampling is almost guaranteed to miss it.
Okay, so this is the stage. We have spectral methods, which are too rigid, GCNs, which are too blunt, and GraphSage, which is too random.
And right into that environment, Veličković and Bengio's team drop graph detention networks.
And the thesis of this paper is deceptively simple. What if we take the attention mechanism that Vaswani just introduced in the transformer paper?
Attention is all you need.
Right. And what if we apply that mechanism directly to the neighborhood of a graph node?
That is the core idea.
Let's really get into the architecture here. This is the meat of the deep dive. I want to visualize this for you listening. Let's say I am a node in a graph. For context, I'm a paper in a citation network.
Okay.
I have my own set of node features. Maybe it's a bag of words vector representing my abstract.
Right. Let's call your feature vector H sub I. And you have a bunch of neighbors, the other papers you cite, and they have their own vectors, H sub J.
What is the very first thing the GATT architecture does to me?
The first step is a shared linear transformation. It projects you into a new dimensional reality. It applies a weight matrix, W, to every single node. So your H sub I becomes W times H sub I.
Okay, that makes sense. That's pretty standard neural net procedure. We're changing the dimensionality and maybe extracting some higher level features right out of the gate.
Exactly. It takes those raw features and transforms them into a latent space where the attention mechanism can actually do its job effectively.
But now comes the magic, the self-attention mechanism itself. The model needs to look at me, WHR, and look at one of my neighbors, WHJ, and ask a question.
It asks, how much do I actually care about this specific connection?
Right. And the paper denotes this attention coefficient as E sub I. Walk me through that core equation. It's EIJ equals A of YYJ. What is that function A?
So in the original transformer paper, A was a dot product. But GAT actually does something slightly different. They concatenate the two vectors.
They just stick them together.
Right. They take your transform features and your neighbor's transform features and stack them side by side.
So if my vector is length 64 and yours is length 64, we now just have a combined vector of length 128.
Exactly. And then they feed that combined vector into a single layer feed-forward neural network.
Just a single layer?
Just one layer. It's parameterized by a weight vector, which they call a vec. So it's a linear combination of those combined features followed by a nonlinearity.
And we really need to highlight the nonlinearity they chose because the paper is very specific about it. They use a Leaky ReLU.
Yes, a Leaky ReLU with a negative input slope of 0.2.
Why Leaky ReLU? Why not just use a standard ReLU, which was everywhere at the time?
It's a subtle detail, but it's critical for training stability. Think about how a standard ReLU works. It completely kills the gradient for anything negative. It just outputs absolute zero.
Right.
In a graph, where connections can be super sparse and the training signals are often really noisy, you do not want to completely kill the flow of information.
You need something to pass back.
Exactly. A Leaky ReLU allows a very small leaky gradient to pass through, even when that neuron is technically inactive. It keeps the signal alive across the graph.
Okay, so for every single one of my neighbors, the network calculates this raw score, EIAJ, but these are just raw scores, right? They could be 5, they could be negative 1,000.
Right. They aren't comparable yet. They're just raw energy values. We need them to be a proper probability distribution.
So we use a softmax.
Exactly. We take the exponential of each score and we divide it by the sum of the exponentials of all the neighbors' scores.
And that finally gives us our alpha I, the actual attention coefficients.
Right. And because of the softmax, this is crucial. The sum of all the alphas for all of your neighbors equals exactly 1.
So if I have 2 neighbors, the model might evaluate them and say alpha 1 is 0.9 and alpha 2 is 0.1.
Yes. It's explicitly learning to say neighbor A is 90% relevant to predicting your state and neighbor B is only 10% relevant.
And this brings up the masked part of the title. Graph attention networks introduced masked self-attention. In a standard language transformer like GPT, every single word attends to every other word in the context window. It's global attention.
Which is an O of n squared operation. If you tried to do global attention on a graph with 1 million nodes, your GPU would literally melt.
So GT masks the attention. It forces me to only look at my first-order connected neighbors.
It explicitly injects the graph structure directly into the attention mechanism. It respects the existing topology. The mask is effectively just the adjacency matrix of the graph.
Okay, so we have these alpha weights. We know exactly who is important in our neighborhood. What is the final step to generate my completely new feature representation, H prime?
The aggregation phase. It's just a weighted sum. We take the features of all your neighbors, multiply them by those respective alpha weights we just calculated, and sum them all up.
Along with my own features, usually.
Right. So you effectively become a composition of your most relevant neighbors.
Now, there is one more major architectural detail we have to cover. If we don't, the ML engineers listening are going to be screaming at us.
The multi-head attention.
Yes. Multi-head. Why do we need multiple heads? Why isn't one attention mechanism good enough?
The best way to think about it is like a real conversation.
Okay.
When you and I are talking, I might be paying attention to your tone of voice to figure out if you're being sarcastic.
Right.
But at the exact same time, I am paying attention to your actual vocabulary to understand the factual content. Those are 2 completely different views of the exact same data stream.
So in a graph, one attention head might learn to focus purely on semantic similarity.
Exactly. And another head might independently learn to focus on structural roles, like whether a node is a hub, or temporal proximity. If you only have one head, the optimization process tends to get stuck. It tries to compress all those different types of relationships into one single vector.
So GKIT runs this entire attention process K times, completely independently, K separate attention mechanisms.
Yeah. In the paper, For the citation networks, they use k equals 8 heads.
And then how do they actually combine the outputs of those 8 head? Because the paper mentions 2 different methods, concatenation and averaging.
It entirely depends on where you are in the network architecture. In the middle hidden layers, they concatenate.
They just stack them.
Right. If you have 8 heads and each one outputs a vector of 8 features, you just stick them together side by side to get a single vector of 64. You want to preserve all that rich information as it flows deeper into the network.
But at the very end, at the final prediction layer,
you average them. At the end, you need a single smooth prediction for your class label. You want a consensus. You don't want 8 completely different predictions for what this node is. You average the results to stabilize the final output and then apply your final activation function, like a softmax for classification.
Okay, so that is the machine. It projects the features, it calculates attention using Leaky ReLU, it normalizes with softmax, it aggregates a weighted sum, and it does it all in parallel across multiple heads.
It's mathematically sound and surprisingly elegant.
But math is one thing. Actual utility is another. I want to circle back to the why. Why was this architecture such a massive breakthrough compared to GCNs?
We talk a bit about the variable weights.
Right, the qualitative advantage, the ability to filter out the noise.
Right. In any real-world graph, edges are inherently noisy. Just because I follow someone on a social platform doesn't mean I actually care about their posts or agree with them. A GAT can learn to basically ignore that noisy edge by assigning it an alpha of 0.01.
While amplifying the edge to a really important colleague with an alpha of 0.99.
Exactly. But the real systemic advantage, the thing that makes this paper legendary, is the efficiency and the inductive capability.
Let's hit efficiency first. They talk about big O notation in the paper. O of V F prime plus E F prime.
Right. V is vertices, E is edges, F is the number of input features, F prime is output features.
The key takeaway for you listening is that there is no matrix inversion happening here.
None, which is huge. Spectral methods choked on matrix inversions. But the attention mechanism in a GAT scales linearly with the number of nodes and the number of edges.
And it's highly parallelizable.
Completely, because the calculation for edge AB is completely independent from edge CD. You can just blast this across a GPU.
Okay, now let's talk about the inductive capability. Because I feel like inductive gets thrown around a lot in ML papers as a buzzword, but in graph learning, it is the difference between a novelty toy and an actual industrial tool.
It really is. Let's make sure we clarify this distinction thoroughly because it is the entire theoretical core of why this paper matters. Transductive versus inductive.
Laid out.
Okay. Transductive learning is like taking a closed book exam where you have somehow already seen the specific questions beforehand.
Right.
The spectral methods we talked about earlier, they fundamentally assume that the entire full graph structure is present during the training phase.
Including the nodes you want to test on later.
Exactly. Even the test nodes are sitting right there in the graph structure.
Yeah.
You just hide their labels from the model. The model learns the specific structure of that exact graph.
So if I add a new node tomorrow,
the basis functions are entirely invalid. The Laplacian matrix has changed dimensions. You basically have to retrain the whole model.
But inductive learning.
Inductive learning is learning the underlying principles. You train your model on graph A, you freeze the model weights, then I hand you graph B. It has completely new nodes, entirely new edges, a shape you have never ever seen.
And the model still works.
It still works perfectly.
Because the GAT learns a localized function. It basically learns how to talk to a neighbor regardless of where that neighbor lives.
That's the perfect way to phrase it. It learns the interaction rules, not the map itself. It learns if a neighbor has these specific features, pay a lot of attention to them. It does not care if that neighbor happens to be node 5 in graph A or node 5000 in graph B.
And that localized reasoning is exactly why GATs could finally move beyond just classifying static citation networks and start tackling real, dynamic, moving problems.
Which brings us perfectly to the experimental results in the paper. Because they didn't just test this on citation networks, they tested it on real biology.
Right, the data sets. Let's look at the battlegrounds they chose. For the transductive setup, they used the classics, Quora, CiteSeer, PubMed.
Standard citation networks. Documents are the nodes, citations are the edges. They used a 2-layer JAT, 8 heads, some L2 regularization, and dropout.
And the results were good. On Quora, GET achieved an 83.0% accuracy, which beat GCNs by about 1.5%.
Right, which is fine. It's solid. But a 1.5% bump is standard state-of-the-art incrementalism. It's a nice paper, but maybe not a paradigm shift.
But then we look at the inductive test, the protein interaction data set. PPI.
The PPI dataset is strictly inductive. This is critical.
Break down the setup for PPI.
So the dataset consists of graphs that correspond to different human tissues. They train the GAT, a 3-layer model with skip connections, this time on 20 tissue graphs, brain tissue, gut tissue, etc.
Okay.
And then they evaluated the model on 2 graphs that were entirely unseen during training.
So the model had never seen the layout, the topology of these specific test proteins before.
Never. It had to look at a completely novel biological network and predict the protein functions based solely on the interaction rules it learned from the other tissues.
And the performance metric here is the micro F1 score.
Right. Now, the previous reigning champion for this inductive task was a variant of GraphSage.
The neighborhood sampling method.
Exactly. And GraphSage hit a micro F1 score of roughly 0.768.
Okay. 0.768. And what did the Graph Attention Network score?
0.973.
I mean, wait. 0.973?
Yes. 0.973.
For anyone listening who works in ML, we usually fight tooth and nail for a 0.01 improvement. People pop champagne over a flat 1% bump. You were telling me they jumped from 0.76 to 0.97.
It was a 20.5% improvement over the best GraphSage result. It's actually turned a really hard problem into a solved problem overnight.
That is just absurd. Why was the gap that massive? Was GraphSage really that bad at biology?
No, GraphSage was a good model, but remember, its fundamental limitation, sampling. GraphSage looked at a random sample of, say, 20 neighbors.
Right.
JAT looked at absolutely everyone in the neighborhood, but it used the attention mechanism to filter out the noise.
So it turns out in biological networks, you really cannot just sample.
Exactly. Biology is incredibly precise. What if the 21st neighbor, the one GraphSage, randomly didn't sample, was the critical enzyme that activated the entire metabolic pathway? GraphSage ignored it completely. Kate saw it, realized it was highly important via the attention coefficient, and amplified it.
That one experimental result alone probably accounts for half of the thousands of citations this paper has gathered.
It absolutely proved that attention wasn't just some gimmick for translation in NLP. It was a fundamental mechanism for reasoning about complex, unstructured data.
They also did something in the paper that I always really appreciate, an ablation study. They tried to break their own model to prove why it worked.
The Const-Gate experiment.
Right. They basically said, okay, maybe it isn't the attention mechanism that's so great. Maybe we just build a really good deep network architecture. Let's turn the attention off.
Right. They hard-coded all the attention weights, those alpha values, to exactly 1, which effectively turns the model back into a very fancy GCN.
And what happened to that 0.973 PPI score?
It plummeted. It dropped down to 0.934.
Which is still high, to be fair.
It's still high because the underlying architecture and the skip connections are solid. But the gap between 0.934 and 0.973 is a massive reduction in the actual error rate.
Right. It definitively proved that the dynamic weighting the attention itself was the primary driver of that state-of-the-art performance.
Absolutely.
I want to touch on one last thing from the paper before we pivot to our speculative segment. Visualizing the black box.
The TS&E plot.
Yeah. The authors took the feature representations from the very first layer of a trained GAT, and they used TS&E to project that high-dimensional data down to 2D space so we mere mortals can actually see it.
And what the plot showed was incredible. Distinct, clearly separated clusters of data. The nodes were naturally grouping together based strictly on their classification classes.
Right, and this visualization really leads into the massive potential for interpretability with GATs, which is basically the holy grail in AI right now.
Because of those attention coefficients.
Right.
Because we literally have those alpha I values, we can theoretically look inside the model and ask it why.
Right. Why did you classify this specific protein as an enzyme?
And the model can point directly to specific edges and say, because this specific neighbor had an attention weight of 0.9.
It allows domain experts, biologists, network engineers to actually validate the model's reasoning. If the model says, I made this prediction based heavily on node X, and the biologist knows node X is totally irrelevant,
then the expert knows the model is hallucinating or relying on a spurious correlation.
It takes the neural network black box and turns it into, well, maybe a gray box.
A translucent box.
Yeah.
Which, in the sciences, is very often good enough.
So that is the paper. It's efficient, it's inductive, it's incredibly powerful. It really is a masterclass in borrowing a concept from one field NLP and successfully transplanting it to solve a bottleneck in another field.
And it essentially set the stage for everything that came after it in geometric deep learning. Graph transformers, diffusion models on graphs, they all basically stand on the shoulders of Gate.
But I think we spent enough time looking back at 2018.
It is time to look sideways.
It is time for Novel Notions. For you listening, this is the segment of the deep dive where we take the rigorous science we just spent an hour discussing and we use it to fuel some completely unproven, highly speculative, and potentially lucrative new research ideas.
And standard disclaimer here, these are entertainment scenarios generated by us. We are not responsible if you fail your PhD defense because you pitched one of these. They are experiments in thought, not code.
But if you do take one of these and win a Turing Award, we definitely expect a shout out.
Or at least a really nice fruit basket.
Absolutely. Okay, I have a concept that I've been kicking around while rereading this paper. I call it the inductive time traveler.
Okay, you have my attention. Pun completely intended.
We spent a lot of time talking about how GAT is an inductive learner. It works perfectly on unseen graphs.
Right.
And we talked about citation networks like Quora and CiteSeer. Now, typically we use a GAT to classify existing papers in the network, right? Is this paper about AI or is it about biology?
Right, standard node classification.
But science itself is temporal. It's not a static grid. It's a constantly growing graph. What if we used a GAT, not to classify the present state of the graph, but to predict the graph of the future?
You mean link prediction? Because that's a pretty standard graph task.
No, but not just predicting who's going to cite whom. I mean generating the ghost nodes themselves.
Okay, unpack this. What is a ghost node?
Imagine we train a massive GAT on the entire historical graph of RxCD up to today. All the papers, all the citations.
Okay.
Now, you and I want to write a paper. We have a hypothesis. I take my hypothesis, a bag of keywords, my abstract, and I feed it into the GAT as a ghost node.
So it's a node that has features, but zero existing edges.
Exactly. And I asked the GAT to use its inductive attention mechanism to attend to the entire existing literature graph.
So it calculates the alpha weights between your new idea and literally every paper ever written.
Yes. And those attention weights tell me the path of least resistance. It tells me, if you want this paper to be taken seriously and accepted, you must connect to these 5 specific clusters.
It's an optimization engine for peer review. That's clever.
But let's take it a step further. Once we establish those theoretical links, that ghost node becomes a permanent part of the simulated graph.
Okay.
Now we iterate. We ask the GAT, given that this new node now exists, what is the next node that becomes mathematically probable?
Wow. You are essentially simulating the evolution of scientific discovery.
I want the GAT to tell me, in 2027, the field of graph neural networks is mathematically guaranteed to merge with quantum topology.
Because the attention mechanism sees the feature vectors converging before the human researchers do.
Precisely. It sees that these 2 disparate neighborhoods are starting to look at each other based on their features, even if there are absolutely no edges drawn between them yet.
That is actually incredibly plausible, because it leverages the variable weights aspect perfectly. A GCN could never do that because it inherently relies on existing structural edges. A GAT can create the edges based entirely on feature compatibility.
Right. I'm telling you, the inductive time traveler, there is a massive startup in there somewhere.
Well, I have one for you. Let's go back to that incredible PPI dataset result, that 0.973 score.
The massive biology win.
Right. The paper proved definitively the GATs can generalize across different human tissues. You train on brain tissue, you test on kidney tissue, and it works.
Right.
But why stop at human tissues?
Wait, you want to go cross-species?
I call it the phylogenetic bridge. Look, here's the fundamental problem in drug discovery right now. We cure cancer in mice every single day.
We really do. And then it completely fails in human clinical trials.
Exactly. And it fails because the graph of a mouse, its specific protein interaction network, is similar but not identical to a human's. The topology is fundamentally different.
Right. So the transductive models just fail when you move to human trials.
Yes. But what if the underlying physics of protein interaction are exactly the same?
The actual rules of the game haven't changed, just the specific players on the board.
Correct. So we train a massive multi-head GAT on the interactomes of model organisms, mice, yeast, fruit flies, because we have absolute mountains of data for those, and it's cheap. We learn the attention heads on that data.
So one head learns, say, hydrophobic binding rules, and another head learns metabolic signaling pathways.
Because these are universal biological constants. Then we take that fully trained GAT, freeze the weights, and run it purely inductively on the human biological graph.
A completely zero-shot transfer from mouse to human.
We predict drug toxicity or efficacy in humans based solely on how the drug disrupted the abstract patterns in the mouse graph without caring about the specific proteins involved.
That is actually probably a lot safer than what pharmaceutical companies do now. You are using the GAT to completely abstract away the species difference.
You are attending to the function of the interaction, not the identity of the specific node.
That's brilliant. I love it. Listeners, if you write that paper, make sure you cite talk tensors in proper APA format.
Yeah, we will definitely be watching the archive feed for that one.
So to wrap this all up, graph attention networks.
The paper that essentially taught neural networks how to listen.
It absolutely solved the irregular domain problem. It solved the inductive learning bottleneck. And I think fundamentally it showed us that in a deeply connected world, you are defined by exactly who you pay attention to.
Which leaves us with our final thought for the deep dive.
If an artificial neural network defines its entire identity by calculating a weighted sum of its neighbors, do we do the exact same thing? Are you really your own independent features, or are you just the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time paying attention to?
I think I seriously need to reevaluate my attention coefficients after this.
Keep your gradients flowing and your attention masked. This is Talk Tensors, signing off.